World leaders arrive in New York for the 71st United Nations General Assembly. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. With a mission of continuing discussions on sustainable development, the annual United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York. From climate change to the refugee and migrant crises, world leaders discuss pressing global issues. Here to preview this week's events, CCTV's Nathan King joins us now from New York. And Nathan, the first full day of UN General Assembly events have wrapped up, otherwise known as UNGA events. How did that go?
Well, all the focus was basically on refugees and migration, the first ever UN summit on refugees and migration, and it's very timely. As you know, we've never had as many refugees since the Second World War. Refugees and migrants now totaling over 65 million people worldwide. Now, the UN basically admitting that there hasn't been an easy solution to the problem. As you know, there is a backlash against immigration, not just here in the United States, but in Europe, and a reticence to take in refugees across the Middle East, in the Gulf states, for example, right next to Syria. We have a Sudan crisis, which has 1 million refugees and 1.6 million internally displaced. So this unity, this whole idea was bringing countries together in a semblance of unity to chart the way forward, pledging more education for children in refugee camps, more jobs for refugees in host countries. But they haven't come up with an all-encompassing plan. Countries are being told to come up with action plans on their own in the next 2 years. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was here and spoke, talking of having to give the dignity to each refugee, their individuals, and recognizing their hopes and dreams, and also pledging $100 million in extra donations to tackle the problem as well, Anand.
And Nathan, what's on the agenda for the rest of the week?
Well, actually, we have another refugee summit, World Leaders Refugee Summit, organised by US President Barack Obama on Tuesday. That's where everyone's going to get out their checkbooks. China's started, but they're looking for pledges of about $3 billion to help refugees. The US is in a bit of a difficult position right now because, of course, of its election, and also that they pledged to take more Syrian refugees, but may not hit the number that they're asking everyone else to do in terms of percentages. Then it's on to the major speeches, of course. We have the last speech from the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. He is leaving office at the end of the year, as is, of course, US President Barack Obama. So it's about legacy time for those two men. What will we hear from them? And also, it's a bit of a changeover in terms of other leaders too. Brazil, which traditionally speaks first at the UN General Assembly, has Michel Temer, and of course a new Prime Minister from the UK, Theresa May, will also be speaking on the first day. It's going to be very interesting to see where they talk about the world. As you know, there are deep divisions on the way forward, and the one uniting theme here is about sustainable development over the next 15 years. A lot of what we saw at the G20 summit in Hangzhou recently is going to be talked through a little bit more about all boats rising together in the global economy, not just some countries streaking ahead. Anand?
Right, Nathan, and we will be talking about that during the rest of the show. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting from New York. Earlier, I spoke with diplomat Peter Thompson of Fiji, the president of this year's General Assembly, about the outlook for this week. I started by asking him about one of the main events he'll be overseeing as president, and that is the election of a new Secretary General.
Well, I think you've already seen a major difference in the process of selecting the Secretary General. Under the 70th session of the General Assembly, which has just ended, there were extensive hearings organized by my predecessor of the 12 candidates for the position of Secretary General. They were, not only did they individually meet with the General Assembly and be subject to 2 hours of interactive question and answer with the membership, but there was also a town hall meeting at which all the candidates participated, and it was very open, transparent society with representatives of civil society also asking questions. So we've had, for the first time in the United Nations history, a very open hearing on the qualities of the candidates for the next Secretary General. As you're aware, the process has now moved to the Security Council. Under the Charter of the United Nations, it's up to the Security Council to now select one of these candidates for the job, and that is stipulated under the Charter. But the Security Council has been greatly helped by the transparency of the process during the 70th session. Once the Security Council has made their decision, of course, they'll be referring it back to the Assembly for us to make the actual appointment. And we expect that to happen smoothly, probably in late October is the most likely date. There's nothing fixed at this stage.
There have been increasing calls in recent years for reform at the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. At the moment, there are 5 permanent Security Council members, as I mentioned, and 10 rotating members. There are countries in the world that want that to expand, to be more members on the Security Council. Is that likely to change?
Look, first of all, can I say that I'm a reform-minded person, as long as the reform is logical. I was personally responsible for fighting through, in 2010, 2011, the change of name from the Asian group to the Asia-Pacific group. Now, when I was doing that, it took me 14 months of doing it, I was told that reform doesn't happen at the United Nations, that we were stuck in the 1950s. Well, it's just not true. This is an organic institution. We make changes as we go along. Now, on Security Council reform, it is true that it's been a while since there have been reform measures taken on the Security Council, but it is the clear understanding of all that reform is needed. There is no member state talking against reform of the Security Council. It's just a question of how we do it, when we do it, and what is the nature of the change. And that is under very active discussion now, and will continue to be under active discussion. But this is a matter for all member states. We have to satisfy the membership that the reforms that we're going to undertake are the best, especially with an eye to the future, with an eye to the 21st century, the great challenges of the 21st century. You know, climate change, a great example of where the Security Council needs to be fit for purpose. So we will be addressed to that, and I, as President, will be seized of that throughout the 71st session.
Right, China is one of the permanent members, one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. What role is China playing in pushing this reform agenda and pushing the agenda of the General Assembly?
China plays a very positive, productive role here at the United Nations. I was recently in Beijing, and I met there with Premier Li, and he underlined to me how much importance China places on the United Nations and full engagement and support of the United Nations. If you look at China's role, obviously in the Security Council, it plays a major role there as one of the permanent members, but in the General Assembly, yes, it's we all have equal voting rights in the General Assembly, but China obviously has a huge role to play with all its assistance that it's giving for the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, for South-South cooperation, for UN peacekeeping. Its contribution is massive.
A major theme of this year's meetings is the Sustainable Development Goals. What can you tell us about progress towards achieving those goals?
You know, again, during my recent visit to Beijing, and I went from there to Delhi, where I met with Prime Minister Modi, I was really heartened to see how China has absorbed the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda into its own national plans. The 13th five-year National Development Plan has already incorporated the goals into it. I found the same thing in India, that the planning commissions right down to state level are absorbing the goals. You know, the stakes are very high when it comes to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This is humanity's plan to give our grandchildren a sustainable place on this planet. And the role, I have to emphasize the role of the media here. While it is true that governments, and I'm very encouraged by the level to which governments have absorbed these 17 development goals into their national plans, while that is true, I don't believe that humanity as a whole yet is aware of them. And the media has a huge role to play in letting every human being know that this is a responsibility that they carry for their grandchildren and those that come after them, that we have to get this 2030 agenda into action, every human being working on it, understanding it, consumption patterns, production patterns, what it means for our environment, and everybody has to understand that so that our grandchildren and the generations that come after them enjoy the same kind of planet that we have up to now.
Part of those goals, of course, climate change. Last year, world leaders met in Paris and passed the Climate Change Accord. How is the General Assembly addressing these environmental concerns?
Well, in the Sustainable Development Goal, we have SDG 13, which is, addresses climate change and what we have to do to tackle it. I have met recently as the President-elect, but of course I'm now President, with the head of the UN CCC based in Bonn, and the Secretary General there has the responsibility of taking forward the climate agenda from the various COPs following on from the Paris Agreement, and we will go to Morocco later this year. The two of us have agreed to cooperate seamlessly to do whatever is required to take forward the Paris Agreement's the elements of the Paris Agreement. And on this score, I really want to emphasize how pleased the international community was when it heard China's announcement just before the G20 that it was ratifying the Paris Agreement. This is great news. The US president has also made same noises. So speaking as the former representative of Fiji, which was the first country in the world to ratify the Paris Agreement, I can say that we are really enthused about the progress we're making towards ratification of the Paris Agreement.
Another major challenge for the United Nations, the refugee crisis. Tens of millions of people forced from their homes by war, by hunger, by economic conditions. Looking at this year's meetings, what's the plan?
There is a summit happening on Monday next week, which is being very highly attended by heads of government and ministers, where we will address this matter. We have over the last 6 months been negotiating an outcome document for this summit, and I'm very pleased with the balanced nature that we have there. Rest assured that this is a matter that is absolutely at the highest priority in the United Nations. We in that outcome document will be moving forward to the creation of a compact on migration. And that's our goal, to get that in place by 2018. We, of course, on Monday will be hearing from all sides of the debate on the current situation. Yeah, but can I say that as President, I really appeal to all nations to recognize that migration is not some sort of short-term aberration. Yes, it's being exacerbated at current times by the war in the Middle East, but migration is a constant for humanity, always has been. And we have to show the decency that we expect of human beings and of nations in assisting people who are on the move, especially when they're fleeing from climate change, desertification, rising sea levels, but also when they're fleeing from war and persecution. So let's go for the high ground here. Let's not listen to the demagogues who are trying to turn this into a story of xenophobic hate. That is unacceptable for human beings in the 21st century, for us to be misled in that way.
Mr. President, thanks for joining us. And we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, more on what to expect from this year's United Nations General Assembly. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the United Nations General Assembly, here to discuss the outlook for this year's United Nations General Assembly meetings. From Beijing, Liu Tiehua is Professor of International Studies at Beijing Foreign Studies University. From New York, Ragida Durkheim is a columnist and senior diplomatic correspondent for Al Hayat Daily. And with us here in the studio, Daniel Honig is a Professor of International Development at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's go to New York and Ragida. Ragida, as we heard from Peter Thompson there's a number of priorities for this assembly: the election of a Secretary General, climate change, the refugee crisis, and of course marking those sustainable development goals. Now, we do know that we're going to have a new Secretary General by October, as he pointed out, but are we likely to see much progress on those other issues that he mentioned?
Well, I think the issues that they are hoping to get some accomplishment about are easier when it comes to the economic issues, to the development issues, but it seems to me they're stuck in the political. On Syria, they're stuck. On resolving the refugees issue, they're stuck. Yes, of course, it's important that they're having a summit or two summits, if you will, on the refugees, but I'm not so sure the solutions. I mean, I'm not so sure that the opportunity was seized as it should have been. I think you're going to find many people sort of trying to secure their legacies or defend their legacies, if you will, starting from President Obama, ending with Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. So I think the problems persist largely because the conflicts persist without a real solution to these conflicts. Above all, Syria, Libya, Yemen, that unfortunate part of the Middle East.
Liu Tiehua, what will China be bringing to this year's General Assembly meetings, and what are China's priorities?
Actually, I think China will play a more active role in the UN meetings. As a Chinese proverb goes, 言必行，行必果, which means that you need to be trustworthy in words and resolute in deeds. As President Xi visited New York last year and had some promises, I think, our Premier Li Keqiang's visit this time will just demonstrate that China would like to share more responsibilities with the international community and also providing more public goods to the world. And secondly, I think, China would get more involved in wider range of issues, because we are used to getting involved more in the peace operations, because there are three pillars for the United Nations, namely peace, development, and human rights. And we're used to getting involved in the peace before. But I think from now on, and we have noticed that China would play a vital role in development area, because with the economic development in China in these years, I think we've got a lot of experiences and lessons to share with the world. In the just accomplished G20 summit in Hangzhou, and we saw that for the first time, the countries have adopted the G20 action plan for 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And also for the first time, we encouraged the cooperation with the African countries, especially the least developed countries in the world. So all of these, I think, have a lot of implications for our future strategy.
Dan, how relevant or effective is the United Nations as an international forum, as a platform, to get these very important issues resolved? I mean, we hear speakers, they get their voices heard at the United Nations, but at the end of the day, is it just big nations like the United States, or perhaps the other members of the UN Security Council as well, that actually get things done?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's good to separate out the two parts of that question, relevance and effectiveness, right? So in terms of relevance, the UN is the only big tent we have, quite frankly. It is the place where smaller countries can have their voices heard, can hear their issues heard. And we've seen change from General Assembly to General Assembly in terms of things getting on the agenda. Are the Security Council veto players the most influential members of that system? Absolutely. And that's by design. But it's not the case that others can't participate. In terms of effectiveness, there are definitely things that can be done to make the UN more effective. The veto players, for one, keep things from getting done. And the proposal to expand Security Council membership, whatever its benefits might be in terms of representation, would, by adding more actors, also lead potentially to even less function, even less action on behalf of the UN.
Yeah, I want to get to that reform agenda in just a moment, but let me go back to Ragida in New York. Ragida, as we heard Peter Thompson tell us there that there's going to be an election for a new Secretary General. He is trying to make this as transparent a process as he can. But yet we read in the Financial Times, it had a story on this, and it said that the process is, although there are desires to have it transparent, the process is now retreating into a more familiar exercise in backroom deal-making that is being dominated by both the rivalries of European politics and Cold War tensions between the United States and Russia. Is that
absolutely true.
Is that
absolutely true.
Fair assessment, yeah?
Yeah, it's a very fair assessment. Look, I have been here at the United Nations for 40 years. This is my 40th anniversary, my 40th General Assembly, and I have been here since Voltime. And so that makes me the longest serving journalist at the United Nations. But the point is that I'm trying to make is that it's almost business as usual all the time. Yes, it's been much more transparent in the process of the straw polls, in the process of going to the General Assembly. There was a feeling that, this is not the club of the members of the Security Council who was making this choice alone, so bring in the General Assembly and let the member states feel good about it. And yes, it's good. But in the final analysis, it is going to boil down either to the agreements between the United States and Russia or to the current mode and mood of disagreements between the United States and Russia. So it boils down to these two, though it is three others who have the veto power. As to China, and I would like to comment, if you don't mind, on the commentator from China, it will be wonderful to have China play a more active role and a wider role. But it's also important that we hope that China will play its role in the Security Council with all its privileges, rather than sometimes subtracting that to Russia, for example, on Syria, so leaving the leadership role to Russia. I hope that this is true, that China is going to come in with its own set of ideas and its own priorities and action in the General Assembly and the Security Council. But I think it boils down to two, Russia and the United States, who are going to tell us what the surprise is, who is the Secretary General. And it may take several times over. I remember at times when they were not agreeing to a candidate, we had several back and forth sessions between the General Assembly and the Security Council in order to choose the Secretary General of the United Nations. So we'll see what happens.
What do you make of that, Dan, that we hear speaker after speaker and all the candidates making their pitches, but ultimately this is going to be decided by someone sitting in the Oval Office here and someone sitting in the Kremlin in Moscow?
Yeah, so I actually think that's kind of a good thing. That isn't to say that it's a good thing that only those two actors matter, but it's a good thing that we have an international system set up in such a way as to maintain support from the most powerful nations, right? Mm-hmm. The League of Nations failed precisely because not incorporating power into an understanding of who leads global groups leads those groups to be unstable. I think we should broaden who is part of that mix, but I do think actually it's a good thing for the UN's continuation and for the international community that we make sure that powerful states are behind the choice of Secretary General.
Okay, Liu Tuo, we mentioned reform, the reform agenda at the United Nations a moment ago. I mean, what is China's position on reforming the Security Council, for instance, to expand the number of people on the Security Council and to expand the number of permanent members as well?
Actually, we always encourage the reform of the United Nations Security Council. But as our professor from Johns Hopkins just mentioned, after the World War II, and we have just witnessed the fiasco of the League of Nations because of that probably lack of those kind of great powers negotiations, because one country, one vote, will probably delay, the result and the negotiation process. So we'd better have a better resolution and a better idea about, what would come out as a new format for the United Nations Security Council, as now it tackles more and more very furious confrontations and conflicts in that framework. And also there have been different reform plans for the United Nations, like adding some permanent members, or adding some permanent members without veto rights. So I think it still takes time for those P5 states and some I would like to say the related states, because they might come from different countries and regions. There might be some Asian candidates and some African candidates,
right.
And in each regions, they have their priorities. So I think we should be prudent, and it still might take time for the reform.
Right, Ragida, I just want to get to one other point quickly, and that is climate change. We heard Peter Thompson talk there about the Paris Agreement. Of course, there'll be pressure now to get that agreement ratified by the nations. So far, 27 countries have ratified the deal. Are we going to see more nations get on board? Do you sense there's a recognition at the United Nations that this is an urgent issue that needs to be addressed right now?
Well, yes, there is a recognition, but there is also laxing in some countries' approach. They're not very sure that they want to do it, if you will. But yes, of course, it's a big success story for the United Nations. They all congratulated each other and themselves. And in fact, I heard some people say that this is the legacy of Ban Ki-moon. Of course, it's the work of countries, not of the Secretariat. So it's an important issue, and everybody knows the importance of it. And so I suppose there would be more people subscribing to what it takes to make this a better world. But there will still be arguments and obstacles. I just feel, if you permit me to say one thing quickly about that veto power, it is really wonderful to have big powers make major decisions, but unfortunately the way it's been used, the veto powers, that has been in the service of national interests rather than of the interest in the international peace and security. This is supposed to be a body to guard international peace and security. International, not only national, then everything else afterwards. So maybe the day will come. I hope that this will change.
All right, great point, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. I can't get the views of our other two guests. Thanks for being with us, all of you. That's all we have time for. You can follow our coverage on air and online. Just visit our website at cctv-america.com/UNGA. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.